Welcome to Course of Principles of Ecology in Spatial Planning. Here are the content we will cover in this course. The aim of this lecture is to outline which key ecological principles should be incorporated into the current system of planning landscape change, so that the result is a prosperous and truly sustainable landscape. A landscape that offers opportunities for societal development, while still respecting natural potential and carrying capacity. This approach relies on knowledge-based decision-making, understanding the consequences of land use change and balancing human interventions with measures that strengthen the landscape's resilience to natural risks. We will focus on three essential aspects of sustainable spatial planning. First, we need to understand how the landscape functions ecologically, how natural systems interact with human development, and why these relationships should be reflected in planning decisions. Second, it is important to identify the links between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and land use. Healthy ecosystems provide crucial services. They filter water, regulate temperature, store carbon, and create conditions that support biodiversity. All these functions are directly shaped by how we use the land. And finally, we must recognize the role of resilience and carrying capacity. Resilience determines how well landscapes can adapt to change and recover from disturbances, while carrying capacity reminds us not to push ecosystems beyond their limits. Together, these principles guide us toward planning that meets human needs while respecting the inner workings of landscape systems, a balance that is essential for long-term sustainability. There are several key concepts that shape sustainable planning. First, integrating ecological principles into planning means taking into account natural processes, landscape principles, and environmental limits in every decision. Ecosystem services, such as clean water, pollination, and climate regulation, are the benefits we rely on, and planning must protect and enhance these functions. This means that current planning systems must be oriented towards resilience and sustainability. Our goal is to create spaces that can adapt to change and endure over time without degrading resources. Carrying capacity reminds us that every place has its limits. Exceeding them leads to ecological stress and long-term problems. Finally, green infrastructure offers practical solutions, networks of natural and semi-natural areas that support biodiversity, manage water, and improve livability in cities. Together, these principles form the basis for planning that works with nature, not against it. Ecological spatial planning provides an integrated framework for aligning land use decisions with the functional dynamics of ecosystems. Its key concepts emphasize the need to understand and preserve ecological processes that sustain both environmental quality and human well-being. Approaches such as ecosystem services assessment, nature-based solutions, ecological zoning, and green infrastructure offer complementary perspectives that support more resilient, multifunctional, and sustainable landscapes. The following sections outline the conceptual foundations of these core elements. Ecosystem services refer to the wide range of benefits that humans obtain from functioning ecosystems. These include provisioning services, such as food, water, and raw materials, regulating services, climate regulation, flood mitigation, water purification, cultural services, recreation, aesthetic value, cultural identity, and supporting services, soil formation, nutrient cycling, biodiversity maintenance, that underpin all other ecological functions. The concept highlights the dependency of human well-being on healthy ecosystems and provides a framework for integrating ecological value into spatial planning and policy development. Ecological resilience refers to the capacity of an ecosystem to absorb disturbance, adapt to change, and retain its essential structures, functions, and processes. A resilient ecosystem can withstand shocks, such as extreme weather events or land use pressures, while maintaining long-term stability and ecological performance. In spatial planning, ecological resilience is a key criterion for designing landscapes that remain functional under climate change, support ecosystem services, and reduce the vulnerability of both natural and human systems. Ecological vulnerability describes the degree to which an ecosystem is susceptible to harm from external stresses or disturbances, such as climate change, land use intensification, pollution, or invasive species. It reflects the sensitivity of ecological components, their exposure to pressures, and their limited capacity to recover. In spatial planning, assessing ecological vulnerability helps identify fragile habitats, prioritize conservation measures, and guide development away from areas where ecological functions are at the greatest risk. Ecological zoning is a spatial planning tool that categorizes land into zones based on ecological characteristics, vulnerability, and capacity of human use. By identifying areas of high conservation value, ecological corridors, vulnerable habitats, or zones suitable for sustainable development, ecological zoning supports informed decision-making and minimizes conflicts between land use and ecological integrity. This method often incorporates biodiversity assessments, ecosystem function analysis, and landscape connectivity models. The result is a planning framework that protects critical ecological processes while guiding development to more suitable locations. Nature-based solutions are strategically designed actions that use natural processes and ecosystems to address societal challenges, such as climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, declining biodiversity, and sustainable urbanization. Examples include restoring wetlands to mitigate flooding, implementing urban green roofs to regulate microclimate, or creating multifunctional landscape features that enhance resilience. Green infrastructure can also be considered a form of nature-based solutions. Green infrastructure refers to a strategically planned network of natural and semi-natural areas, such as parks, wetlands, woodlands, river corridors, and green urban elements, that are managed to deliver a broad range of ecosystem services. It enhances ecological connectivity, supports climate adaptation, improves environmental quality, and contributes to human health and well-being. Green infrastructure is inherently multifunctional, providing ecological, social, and economic benefits within both urban and rural landscapes. Green infrastructure is based in strategic planning approach designed to counteract fragmentation of green spaces caused most often by urbanization. Rather than viewing green areas as isolated patches, GI focuses on creating ecological networks that connect habitats across the urban matrix and the surrounding landscape. The concept is rooted in landscape ecology and uses spatial planning tools to maintain or restore ecological flows within cities and surrounding landscapes, supporting biodiversity and resilience. Rapid urban expansion disrupts natural habitats, isolating green spaces and reducing ecological functionality. GI addresses this by forming interconnected networks of ecological hubs and corridors that allow species movement, facilitate ecological processes, and sustain ecosystem services such as cooling, water regulation, and pollination. This network-based approach enables cities to function in synergy with natural systems, rather than in opposition. GI planning draws directly from landscape ecology. Structural connectivity refers to the physical arrangement of green patches, such as riparian belts, parks, and forest strips, while functional connectivity focuses on how organisms and ecological processes actually move across the landscape. Effective GI requires both. Physical corridors alone are insufficient if they don't support real ecological functioning. Green infrastructure is inherently multifunctional. Ecologically, it reduces climate risks, mitigates heat islands, and supports habitat quality. Socially, it promotes public health and access to recreational spaces. Economically, GI contributes to sustainable development by increasing ecosystem service value and reducing costs associated with climate hazards and land degradation. When planning for landscape use, it is essential to rely on fundamental ecological principles that help us understand both the structure and the functioning of the environment. This begins with the analytical and synthetic assessment of the landscape, meaning not only describing individual features in detail, but also interpreting them together to understand how they shape the character of the area. A key part of this approach is looking at the landscape as a system, not just as separate elements, but as a network of connections and interactions between natural and human components. Instead of focusing on isolated elements, we examine how all parts of the landscape are connected and how they interact. Seeing these relationships helps us recognize cause and effect, understanding how one change in the environment can trigger another and how these processes influence the landscape's stability and resilience. Closely linked to this is understanding the fundamentals of the landscape. This means analyzing and interpreting its key characteristics. What makes the landscape unique, how its natural processes function, and which features influence its development. A solid understanding of these fundamentals is crucial for making well-informed, responsible decisions. Ecological planning also requires thinking within a wider context. Every local intervention has consequences that reach beyond the immediate site, influencing broader regional relationships. Considering these larger-scale dynamics allows us to evaluate potential changes more responsibly. Another important principle in ecological planning is landscape resilience and stability. When making decisions, we need to consider how well the landscape can cope with change, whether it can absorb disturbances, withstand environmental pressures, and regenerate its natural functions over time. Some areas, especially those already weakened or degraded by human activity, have limited capacity to recover and therefore require special care, targeted interventions, or protective measures. Understanding the resilience of different landscape types helps ensure that planned changes do not exceed their natural thresholds. Equally essential is the protection of ecological processes and functions. A landscape is not defined only by its visible features. It is sustained by ongoing natural processes such as the water cycle, soil formation, nutrient flows, species migration, and ecological connectivity. These processes form the underlying framework that allows ecosystems to remain healthy and functional. Planning should therefore respect these dynamics, not interrupt them, but support them. Preserving ecological functions ensures long-term environmental stability, enhances biodiversity, and improves the landscape's ability to adapt to future challenges. Together, these principles remind us that effective planning is not only about managing space, but about sustaining the natural systems that make the landscape viable, resilient, and capable of supporting both nature and human needs. A further key aspect of ecological planning is the sustainable use of resources. Natural resources such as water, soil, and biodiversity must be used in a way that does not compromise their ability to renew themselves or their long-term availability. This means carefully considering the limits of each resource and ensuring that human activities do not exceed the landscape's natural capacity. Sustainable use protects not only the current quality of the environment but also the well-being of future generations. Closely linked to this is the prevention and minimization of negative impacts. In landscape planning, it is always more effective, and far less costly, to prevent environmental damage than to repair it afterwards. This requires anticipating potential risks such as soil erosion, flooding, biodiversity loss, landscape fragmentation, or the degradation of ecological functions. By integrating preventive measures into planning processes, we can reduce vulnerabilities, maintain ecological stability, and avoid irreversible damage. Together, these principles reinforce the idea that responsible planning must balance human needs with the preservation of natural systems, ensuring that development remains both ecologically sound and sustainable over the long term. This approach to spatial planning emphasizes evidence-based and ecologically responsible integration of human activities with the intrinsic characteristics of the landscape. The underlying principle is rational land use in accordance with the landscape potential, i.e., the natural capacities, functions, and ecological limits that the area can sustainably support. This includes factors such as soil quality, hydrological conditions, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. A related concept is the carrying capacity of a territory, which defines the maximum level of human use or intervention that a landscape can tolerate without irreversible degradation. Carrying capacity takes into account physical, ecological, and sometimes social thresholds and helps to prevent problems such as soil erosion, water scarcity, habitat fragmentation, or overloading of local infrastructure. Respecting these limits promotes resilient land use that remains functional even in the face of future environmental and socio-economic pressures. Central to this framework is the identification of territorial deficits, together with the delineation of vulnerable and sensitive zones. Vulnerable zones identify areas where ecosystems or natural processes are at increased risk from human activities, such as floodplains, erosion-prone slopes, protected habitats, or areas with limited water retention. Sensitive zones may not yet be degraded, but they contain features of high ecological value or limited regeneration capacity that require proactive protection. The classification of these areas enables targeted conservation measures and informs strategic spatial decisions. To address existing or potential environmental pressures, the planning process must include mitigation and compensation measures. Mitigation measures aim to prevent or at least reduce negative impacts. These measures must be planned as part of the design of buildings and permanent land acquisitions in general. Finally, this methodology requires an assessment of conflicts between current and future land use proposals and ensures that spatial planning transparently addresses conflicting interests. By evaluating long-term consequences and integrating trade-offs into decision-making, planners can harmonize economic, social, and environmental objectives and thus support sustainable territorial development. These principles highlight the essential role of ecology in shaping long-term, resilient territorial development. Biodiversity forms the foundation of ecosystem functions, driving processes such as pollination, water retention, soil formation, climate regulation, and natural hazard mitigation. High biodiversity strengthens the adaptive capacity of landscapes, allowing them to better absorb disturbances such as floods, droughts, or storms. By supporting ecosystem services that directly contribute to human well-being, biodiversity becomes not only an environmental value but also a social and economic asset. A major factor influencing biodiversity trends is land use change, which can either degrade ecosystems or enhance them depending on how interventions are planned and managed. Urban expansion, agricultural intensification, and infrastructure development often lead to habitat fragmentation, soil degradation, and the loss of ecological corridors. However, when guided by strategic spatial planning, land use change can instead support ecosystem restoration, create green infrastructure networks, and improve ecological connectivity. Thus, spatial planning acts as a crucial tool for shaping land use in a way that minimizes negative impacts while promoting ecological coexistence. Achieving sustainable development requires reconciling human needs, housing, mobility, energy, production, with the ecological constraints of the landscape. This involves respecting environmental thresholds, preserving critical ecosystem functions, and ensuring that development does not exceed the land's carrying capacity. By integrating ecological integrity into planning decisions, it becomes possible to design built environments that function in harmony with natural systems, supporting resilience, environmental health, and long-term sustainability. A good example of applying ecological principles to the spatial planning process is the issue of floods and inundations. Their intensity and frequency have been changing in recent years, and they represent one of the most destructive natural hazards globally. Climate change further exacerbates the situation. We are experiencing more intense precipitation and rising sea levels, which increases overall risk. At the same time, cities continue to expand, and new development often occurs in flood-prone areas. This calls for a new conceptual approach. Traditionally, the response was straightforward: build barriers, dikes, and large dams in the landscape, and in built-up areas protect buildings with flood walls and embankments. In other words, flood protection relied mainly on technical measures, which often represented a significant intervention in ecosystem stability. However, it is becoming clear that this approach is not sustainable. It focuses primarily on controlling water volumes and frequently addresses problems outside the areas where they originate. Therefore, technical measures must be complemented by smaller, nature-based interventions throughout river basins that reduce the vulnerability of the landscape as a whole. These interventions are usually multifunctional. In addition to flood protection, they can enhance biodiversity or improve the recreational value of the area. The modern approach is therefore flood risk management. It combines technical solutions with smarter spatial planning, deciding where and how we build, and how development will be compensated by measures implemented in the open landscape. For the effect to be functional and sustainable, spatial planning and flood risk management must be addressed together, not in isolation, and within the context of broader territorial relations. In conclusion, integrating ecological principles into spatial planning is not optional, but fundamental to creating resilient and sustainable environments. When cities and landscapes are designed to work with natural processes rather than against them, we strengthen ecosystem services, reduce risks, and enhance quality of life. Addressing landscape challenges at the scale of entire systems, such as whole watersheds, is key to long-term effectiveness, while tools like GIS allow us to translate ecological data into practical, evidence-based planning decisions. Together, these approaches help bridge the gap between environmental science and real-world development. Spatial planning, based on the principles of landscape ecology, aims to maintain biodiversity and ecosystem stability. It offers nature-based solutions by combining ecological thresholds with landscape connectivity to ensure ecosystems remain functional and resilient. The primary goal is to identify key ecological resources, such as forests, wetlands, and other relevant habitats, and connect them through corridors and strategic nodes. These connections enable species movement, energy and material flows, and the provision of robust ecosystem services. Benefits of this approach include enhancing ecological resilience and reducing the negative impacts of habitat fragmentation. Current research is moving from static assessments to adaptive, process-driven models that incorporate knowledge of natural processes, link spatial patterns to functional processes, and take into account landscape dynamics. At the same time, this approach focuses on identifying unintended impacts on the surrounding landscape and balancing ecological and socio-economic objectives. Ecologically based planning is a powerful tool for creating landscapes that are resilient to change, fragmentation, and human pressure. The future lies in dynamic, process-oriented planning approaches capable of adapting to climate change and increasingly intensive land use.